this might seem like just another folktale. It begins, like so many rural legends, a car full of kids on a country road as they encounter something frightening and unexplainable. But unlike stories told to children to keep them inside after dark, this particular encounter was real. For 13 months, the citizens of West Virginia were haunted by a bizarre entity that descended like a shadow from the sky. And with it came a symphony of strange and unsettling events that would eventually crescendo into the ultimate nightmare. To add to this heightened state, the mysterious entity was not alone. It was accompanied by other seemingly supernatural beings, both from above and below. At the eye of the storm was the tiny town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a bustling little burb on the banks of the Ohio River, a town whose people would confront this carnival of horrors head on. Now, thanks to years of pop culture references and a major Hollywood movie, those that live in Point Pleasant may seem like fictional characters to the outside world, but the people are real, and this is their story.
Seth, what are you up to?
I'm just checking out the rewards I got by filling out surveys on Ipsos Issay.
Ipsos Issay? What's that?
Ipsos Issay is a rewards community dedicated to ensuring your valued opinion makes a difference for citizens and brands. Users take part in research and answer simple questions to earn rewards. There's a ton of rewards to choose from, but I prefer the Amazon gift cards. The best part is the surveys are fun to do because they're catered to my interests. I do surveys when I'm waiting on files to export or the latest Small Town Monsters movie to render out. Founded in 1975, Ipsos is the third largest research company in the world with more than 17,500 employees in more than 80 countries. Click the link in this video description to start earning rewards with Ipsos Issay today. Do it!
My family's been here since about 1774. So my mother's family. I've lived here for, other than going to college, 58 years. Obviously, Point Pleasant is a rural community. It's a town of less than 5,000 people. Most of the people's families have been here for a very long time. Everyone knows everybody. It's a very close-knit community. In a big city, this would just be a small suburb, and literally it's neighborhoods from end to end. The town's only about 3 miles long.
The Ohio River flows from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Cairo, Illinois. Access to two major waterways is just one of the reasons Point Pleasant has survived as long as it has. It also boasts a National Guard armory and has been home to various manufacturing facilities for the U.S. Navy, as well as a Naval Reserve Center. Across the river from Point Pleasant lies its sister city of Gallipolis, Ohio. With a population of less than 4,000, most locals think Gallipolis as merely an extension of Point Pleasant. The people of Point Pleasant represent the best of blue-collar America, a people who are both hardy and resourceful.
But it's different. Most of West Virginia is mountains. You're in the High Valley. You're where the two main rivers, the Ohio and Kanawha, come together. So you have a lot of farmland here. You have a rich, fertile river valleys.
Point Pleasant's history is a bloody, messy affair. Even to this day, Native American bodies are still buried throughout the area, with a mass grave located somewhere in the vicinity of what is known as the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. Native tribes in the region traditionally avoided the area of modern-day Point Pleasant due to bad omens associated with lands where waters mingled. However, they would be forced to stand ground in this very area. In 1774, the Shawnee and Mingo tribes banded together to defend their homes, located south of the Ohio River, from what they perceived as an invading Virginia militia led by Colonel Andrew Lewis. The natives waged a furious battle in an attempt to halt continuous advances into their territory in the now infamous Battle of Point Pleasant. After a vicious fight between the two parties, the natives were forced to retreat and were overtaken by the militia. A Shawnee chieftain by the name of Cornstalk negotiated a treaty with the white men. 3 years later, Chief Cornstalk returned to the area for a diplomatic visit at the nearby Fort Randolph. However, upon arriving at the fort, Cornstalk and his sons were taken captive and murdered by the soldiers.
He was the principal chief of the Shawnee Nation. He was instrumental in this war. He did not want this battle, but he really didn't have a choice. He had to fight for his land, he had to fight for his people, he had to do what he felt would be right for his future generations. We didn't own the land. We just cared for the land.
Chief Cornstalk, was a Shawnee chief who was reportedly murdered by some settlers over a land dispute, him and his son both. The legend is told that upon his dying breath, that he cursed, the town of Point Pleasant for 200 years. But I think that, all towns have their share of problems and tragedies and things like that.
First time it was heard of was in a play in the early 1900s.
We found when they tore down a local grade school here about 6 years ago, we found a closet they didn't know about. We found a play from 1923 that the entire town put on their history. And in that play, one of the big scenes is Cornstalk getting shot and cursing Point Pleasant.
They just ran with it. They told it to their daughter, and their daughter told it to her son, and by the time it escalated, he was responsible for everything that went wrong in the whole state.
For over a century, Point Pleasant has been plagued with a string of unfortunate incidents that many would call bad luck. On 4 occasions between 1913 and 1937, the Ohio River overflowed its banks, proving catastrophic for the town. The flooding cost citizens thousands of dollars in damage, and worse, untold grief in the number of lives lost. During the early part of the 20th century, with frequent disasters befalling Point Pleasant, rumors about a bizarre birdman began to circulate. The most startling fact about these birdman stories is that they occurred over 50 years prior to the Mothman encounters of the 1960s. Professor James Gay Jones of Glenville State College documented multiple sightings of the birdman in his book, Haunted Valley and More Folk Tales of Appalachia. The sightings began around 1914, with the creature being described as a large bird with the head of a man and a wingspread of at least 12 feet. It was said to be of monstrous size and was covered in dark, reddish feathers that glistened in the sunlight. According to Jones, sightings of the birdman persisted well into the 1940s, where it was reported by motorists who drove along the Ohio River just outside of Point Pleasant. These encounters were also said to be a prelude or epilogue to a tragic occurrence.
Correct, the ready light is on. Eject mercury umbilical. Oil evacuate. Mercury umbilical clear.
As the 1960s dawned, so too did a new wave of birdman sightings. America was now in the throes of a space race, launching multiple manned missions in an effort to put the first man on the moon. In Vietnam, American soldiers were in their third year of ground combat in a war that seemed to have no end. On November 1st, 1966, a National Guardsman at the Armory near the McClintock Wildlife Management Area claimed to see a brown, half-bird, half-man figure perched in a tree. Less than 2 weeks later, the birdman appeared again, nearly 80 miles east of Point Pleasant.
On November 11th, 1966, in Clendenin, West Virginia, which is a little bit over an hour from here in Point Pleasant, there were 4 men digging a grave. It was later in the evening, almost dusk, and they claimed to see a flying man who flew over top of where they were digging this grave. That was reported to the newspapers and the media at that time. That was one of the first Mothman sightings or big bird sightings that took place even before here in Point Pleasant.
The birdman is only one such figure known to West Virginia folklore. Aside from centuries of ghost tales and stories of mysterious spook lights, there's also the notorious Flatwoods monster. The Flatwoods case, which took place in 1952, revolves around a small town where eyewitnesses came upon a bizarre creature after seeing a glowing object streak across the sky and come to rest on a farm. Like the Flatwoods monster, the birdman was often accompanied by unusual aerial phenomena, like that witnessed by Merle Partridge near his home located less than 90 miles from Point Pleasant.
And all at once, the TV started winding up like a high-pitched generator, like winding up to a fever pitch. At the same time, my dog, the bandit, on the front porch, that dog is carrying on. All at once, as it was winding up, I thought, what in the hell, more than anything else, I got up to go over to turn it down because it was hurting our ears, the way the thing was screaming, and the whole picture tube and everything just blew out in the middle of the floor. And man, I run out the front door to front door here, the porch there, and I run out on the front porch. Dog, as I run out, he took off down through the field. Well, the only thing that was in that field was a little pump house. And I looked down, and where he's going, I hollered for him to come back. He wouldn't come back. He wouldn't mind me at all. But when I looked down there, all I seen was red lights going around, like intermittent. They weren't eyes or anything like that, because, so, the dog would not come back. I stood out there and called him for this thing, in fact, this thing disappeared after just a few minutes. First thing that entered my mind was that it was a helicopter. But there was no noise. Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess I called the dog there for a little bit, and I just went back in the house, more or less kind of putting it out of my mind, something weird. The wife was cleaning up the glass and everything from the television, sweeping it up. Oh, as far as I can remember, we just went to bed.
This was all reported to the local authorities, the state police, and the media outlets and things like that. But that dog was never located.
Though locals refer to it as the TNT or TNT area, the McClintock Wildlife Management Area was at one time home to a $45 million munitions manufacturing facility that encompassed an area of more than 8,000 acres. Known as the West Virginia Ordnance Works, the plant was in operation from 1942 to 1945, when it was abandoned after World War II. Shortly thereafter, it became a dumping ground for chemicals and toxic waste before being given to the state for use as a wildlife reserve. During the 1960s, it was frequented by teenagers who took advantage of its seclusion for the purpose of drag racing, or better yet, as a secretive lovers' hangout.
We had a pretty good-sized farm out there, and if you would walk clear to the back of the farm, it was about 1.5 miles into the TNT area from there. Steve Mallett and I'd heard his name quite a bit, and Roger Scarberry, I'd heard their names quite a bit. They were well known around school. The way I heard it back then was that Steve Mallett and his wife, Mary, and Roger Scarberry and his wife, Linda.
About 11 o'clock that night, they had been up riding around, showing off their car. That Roger had a 57 Chevy Bel Air. As they went past that North Power Plant, they saw what they thought was a man standing in the road. It stood about 7 foot tall. It was light gray in color. And Linda said that it had wings folded against its back. As they got closer in the car, she said the wings spread out and it ran towards the North Power Plant. She said it ran in a very awkward manner. It hobbled through the grass, went into the North Power Plant.
They backed out onto the main drag, rushed back down the Fairground Road, and took off towards Point Pleasant.
They decided to go to the sheriff's department. They were hesitant about telling anybody because they thought people would just, think they were making the story up.
When they got over on Route 62, they turned south towards Point Pleasant. They discovered that this creature was chasing them.
Linda said as they turned left onto Route 62, they saw it again, standing by a billboard. She said the wings came out, it went straight up in the air. And as they hit the straight stretch there on Route 62, that's when it came over top of the car. They were doing 90, 95 miles an hour down the straight stretch. It never got in front of the car, but it stayed above the car. It would disappear for a few minutes and then come back. At this point, they were a little concerned because they thought, they could possibly have a wreck or an accident.
He chased them all the way to the city limits, and they said that they reached 100 miles an hour in their car.
That's when they went on to the sheriff's department and sat down and explained what they had experienced.
I had seen something on TV. It was just real short, and it was during those days when that happened, during that week.
As soon as the media caught wind of Linda Scarberry and the Mallett's sightings, curiosity peaked here in Point Pleasant.
It was like Jaws. They said there's a monster in the TNT, everybody grabbed their gun.
People armed with rifles and guns, miles and miles of cars up in the TNT area. It got to the point where the National Guard had to step in and control the amount of people that were coming into the TNT area.
There was only two questions they wanted to know. Number one, are we allowed to shoot it? Number two, if there's more than one, can we shoot two?
The Mothman incidents weren't the only unusual events taking place in West Virginia during 1966. On November 2nd, a man named Woodrow Derenberger is accosted on Highway 77 while driving home from Parkersburg, West Virginia. His antagonist is the occupant of an unidentified flying object which lands on the road in front of him. The being speaks to Derenberger telepathically, referring to himself as Indrid Cold. Much like the Mothman stories would just 2 weeks later, Indrid Cold draws national media attention as Derenberger calmly and matter-of-factly relays the details of his encounter to reporters. Today, it stands as one of the most fascinating UFO stories on record. Also on November 2nd in nearby Gallipolis, Ohio, a woman is outside when she sees a bright flash in the sky above her. She looks up in time to see a massive cylinder-shaped object appear in a downward trajectory. The object lands in a parking lot, and two plain-dressed men exit the craft and proceed to ask her a series of questions in a bizarre dialect. At the same time, two men traveling on Highway 77 near Parkersburg in the same vicinity as Woodrow Derenberger have their own brush with a man who sounds suspiciously like Indrid Cold, or as they refer to him, the Grinning Man. Meanwhile, up and down the Ohio Valley, scores of UFOs are appearing on a nightly basis.
Well, I just covered everything. At that time, I was a general assignment reporter. Whatever happened, whether it was in town or within our coverage area, I was Johnny on the spot, ready to go cover it. Young and ambitious. there was an outbreak of UFO sightings in that whole area from Point Pleasant up Route 35 almost all the way to Charleston. And they would all start out by saying, I know you think I'm crazy, but, and they would tell me these stories about sightings that they had on their land. Usually it involved some sort of machine like a UFO. It got so bad that we basically had a special assignment desk for when people called in to report the UFOs. They would send them over to me, and I would talk to these people about it.
It seems like, to me, that there were some UFO sightings exactly at the Mothman time. People went to the TNT area on Friday night, and while they were there, several claimed to have seen UFOs in the sky over the TNT area. And I believe the night after the Mothman was seen, Marcella Bennett and her brother, I believe Raymond Walmsley, and his wife, I think Kathy Walmsley, those three went to the TNT area, and on the way, they saw a UFO in the sky.
My brother and sister-in-law had decided one night to take a ride to the TNT area, to my sister's house. And then we visited for approximately maybe an hour and a half, and we decided that we was to journey back home. So we went, my brother and Raymond Walmsley, and myself and his wife, Catherine Walmsley, went out. And my brother Raymond kept saying to me, Marcella, look to your right at this light in the sky. And I said, oh, no, you know. And I kept walking, and he said, no, you've got to see this. It's not a plane. I kept walking. And when I got to the car, I had my daughter, Tina, which was about 3 years old at that time. And I reached for the door handle on the car. And when I reached for the door handle on the car with her, Tina, I saw this figure. And from somehow, I was looking, holding onto the door handle, and I started at the feet. And I came up with my eyes looking up, and I could see, I saw no feet, but I saw a grayish cast. And I kept going up, looking up at this creature, and it had wings like a bird with its neck stuck down and stood in a position about like this. At that point, I turned and tried to run back towards the house. And when I did, I couldn't walk. I got within maybe a foot from the creature. And I fell face down, and I laid there on top of my daughter, which I could hear her crying. So by that time, I could hear my brother in the background hollering, come on, Marcella, get up, come on, hurry. So I went back with him, and then we went in the house. And after we got in the house, it hit the door. He came to the door and tried to get in the door, which they had locked. And I was just in and out. They took me to a sofa and laid me down on the sofa. But I just couldn't, I couldn't grasp what I saw. I knew it was nothing from this earth. I knew that the creature, whatever it was, didn't live here.
As sightings continue in neighboring communities, the Mothman continues to make frequent appearances in Point Pleasant. Most often, the creature is encountered in the abandoned North Power Plant inside the TNT area, as it was one night by Bob Bosworth and a friend in November of 1966.
He and I decided to ride that evening, just riding around. There was a very bright moon out, and we were just riding around, and Al said, want to go up through TNT area? And I said, yeah, we might as well. So we're riding out through there, and I remember, you know how guys will mess around.
Right.
Well, the moon was so bright that just, I guess out of boredom, Al turned the headlights off on the motorcycle and was dodging chuck holes by the moonlight. So we're riding out through there, and Al said, look at that. And we stopped, and up on top, on the roof of that old power plant building, it was, I believe, a 3-story building.
Yeah, it was.
And up on top, we seen two big, what looked like red eyes, looking at it. We sat there and looked at it. I said, let's go out and see who it is. He said, yeah. So we went out there. Well, we stopped at, you know, right there underneath the building.
Like an entranceway.
Yeah, we stopped right there, and we looked up. Well, it looked like these eyes were looking down at us then. So we decided to go up. Well, the moon was so bright that it was shining through these openings. Well, we could make out an outline of something in that dark. All of a sudden, this, I really don't know whatever I saw. Alan was right beside of me. It very slowly and precisely walked towards us. We heard it walk. It walked right up and just stayed on the dark side of that distinct line.
Did you notice any red eyes or anything at the time?
No, and I thought about that, and I think what it is because there was no light where it was at in the dark to reflect them. And it had a taper to it, like, well, I compare it with a robin, a bird.
Right.
When their wings are folded, how they're bulged at the top, and then they come down to a taper. And it had no long neck like a bird, like some of these birds they tried to say it was. It just as though it had a head, a large head sitting on its shoulders. Then it very slowly and precisely turned towards the catwalks. You could hear its footsteps in the glass right in front of us. And then when it started walking on the catwalk, never a hesitation, kept on walking. Then we heard that sound like wings.
On November 18th, one of the first major newspaper articles about the Scarberry and Mallett Mothman encounter is published. Within days, more articles run in newspapers across Ohio and West Virginia. The Athens Messenger, a newspaper from the nearby town of Athens, begins covering the Mothman stories extensively thanks to a local reporter named Mary Hyre, who happens to reside in Point Pleasant. Only 3 days since the sighting had occurred, Mothman hysteria is in full swing. Paul Yoder and Benjamin Enochs, 2 volunteer firemen stationed at the TNT area to help control traffic, have their own brush with a large bird at 1:30 a.m. on the 18th. The 2 men see a large white shadow that flies across their car as they're driving near Camp Conley Road. Though they immediately stop the car and search for the bird, they find no trace of it. Both men insist that what they see is nothing more than a large bird, most likely an owl. As more sightings occur, the mystique surrounding the TNT area grows, and so does the number of curious explorers looking for the creature.
We went up there several times, my brother and my twin brother and my sister and the baby brother. And once we turned off the main road, in no time, my brother just kept giving me a funny look. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, don't look. But there's something right beside the window there. So I turned and looked, and that thing was right beside my window. It was so dark, I don't know if it was running or if it's flying. I didn't see any wings, but it was keeping up with the car. I kept hitting my brother on the leg, telling him, hurry up, go faster, go faster. He saw that he wasn't losing it by going faster, and so he saw the turn that goes up into the TNT factory building. And I guess it come in his head at split second, if he turned up in there, it would keep going straight. And we would turn up in there and lose it. But it didn't. He made that sharp turn, a left turn, and it was still right there beside my window. And we went straight up in there and come to another turn that you had to make because you went into the loading dock. And so he whipped around that turn, and just like that, he stopped. And we was trying to collect ourselves. That thing just jumped on the hood of our car and just kind of squatted like, and just watched him, and then me, and then him, and me. We was just sitting there. We didn't know what to do. We was afraid to move. My sister, my 2 brothers crying and carrying on in the back. He told them to get down on the floor and shut up. It was just like we were frozen for a split second. I'm sure it wasn't no more than that. And it just jumped down off the car. It ran a little bit to that great big I say it was 5 stories high because the 4th floor that I didn't even know of till way years later had like a little porch top to it with a tin slanted roof. And that's where it jumped up to. I still say jump because I still recall no wings. If it did, it's blinked out of my mind. And so he just opened up the door and stood right behind the door, and he's picking up chunks of coal. He was picking that up and just throwing it and going shoot, shoot, shoot. And he threw a little bit bigger one, and it landed just probably 4 inches from its foot. And when it did, it's like that thing said, okay, enough's enough, and it stood up. And I thought, oh, he's coming to get us, now see what you done? And he jumped back in the car and slammed the door and locked it and hollered at me, lock the doors. Well, I never did unlock mine in the first place. He jumps up, and just as he gets ready to go over, instead, he just opens up the prettiest set of wings you ever seen on anything. I mean, big wings, big enough to carry you or me or anybody else at least 6 feet. And he didn't flap them like a bird would real fast to hurry up and get flying. He just spread them out and just glided over them there and just went on up in the air and just flew away.
In the 5 days since the Scarberry and Mallett sighting, reports of encounters with Mothman spring up around Point Pleasant. Reports during that time have one unifying theme. The creature seems to be a massive bird. On November 20th, a man named Howard Miller of Nicholas County sees a large bird about 4 feet tall with red, half-moon eyes land on a bus shelter. Later that same day, a couple driving near Ferry Branch, 55 minutes south of Point Pleasant, also see a large bird-like creature. They later report the incident to the Charleston police, adding that the creature landed in a nearby tree after it flew by. Also on the 20th, Brenda Jones of Point Lick, a suburb of Charleston, only an hour from Point Pleasant, sees a large bird dart off on foot into the woods near her home. The next day, a man in Charleston calls police at 10:15 p.m. to report a bizarre sighting. Richard West describes a Batman 6 feet tall with a wingspread of up to 8 feet sitting on the roof of his neighbor's home. He noted its great big red eyes, and when asked if the creature flew, he said, straight up like a helicopter. The helicopter description appears again when Thomas Urey, a Point Pleasant businessman, sees a giant bird circling his car while driving beside the Ohio River outside of town. Mr. Urey, though aware of the bird reports, was not out hunting for monsters when it crossed his path.
Well, when I first saw it, I thought it was a helicopter. Couldn't hear any noise at all. Right. But that far away. But then as it rose over the trees and proceeded to make the big circles over, how birds fly. Right. It started out, I would say, 500 feet in the air, but every time it'd make a circle, I could see it when it came in front of my car. It would come lower and lower. Now, the last pass it made was probably 75 feet over my car. I had a pretty good shot at it. And I would guess, and it's purely a guess, it was at least 10 feet. Wingspan? Wingspan. Yeah, I guess I was scared to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. But then when I saw it wasn't going to attack me or anything, when it first started kept getting lower, I think it was more curious to me and, mutual curiosity. Right. After that, it wasn't scared, it was apprehension. I told George Johnson, the sheriff, I asked him, I said, you're not going to give me a ticket, are you, for speeding? Mm-hmm. But I was probably going 75. When I hit that straight stretch, I was probably doing 90. Mm-hmm. Of course, then I started slowing down after it went back to the river. Right, it went back towards the river. Yeah, right, it came from the river and went back towards the river. Okay. So I don't know if it was nesting over there or what.
The sightings of the Mothman increase, so do the number of descriptions. What first seemed to be an abnormally large bird begins to take on another form altogether in the eyes of some witnesses. Some feel the creature is trying to communicate, but perhaps is unaware of how to do so. Mothman witness Linda Scarberry would later claim to see the creature over 18 times following her initial sighting, including an incident wherein she saw the being lurking outside her home one night. As she stared at it through a window, she sensed a sadness and a vague curiosity emanating from the creature. The odd nature of some reports led to speculation that the creature may not have been of this earth.
There were various reports of the Mothman sightings of being of a supernatural nature, almost a mental type vision of whatever this thing was.
I lived up on Jefferson Avenue. Of course, my wife and we were about 19 years old, I think, at the time. We went to bed that night. The way the bed was, there was a window on my left, and sometime in the night, and it seems to me like it was about 3 o'clock, and I was facing that window, and I looked out the window and looked down at the street light, and there was a crossing. I remember distinctly there was a car come across the crossing, and I turned my head to the right. I mean, I can still feel that, really. Turned my head to the right, and there, to me, it was the devil, Mothman, standing there by my bed, and I just sort of froze up, and I tried to talk, and I couldn't. It was this awful, horrible feeling. And I thought, Lord, what can I do? This thing is here. It must, this evil presence. And it was standing there, and it had a body about 6 feet tall, sort of a dirty lunar color. And I didn't see any buttons or zippers or anything like that, but it was a gray form, like a solid robe, and then without seams down the arm. Then the hands were down, or whatever those were on the other end. They kind of disappeared by the bedside. I didn't see that. And red eyes, and kind of back in like, but it was its presence. Here I am. I can feel that. It was this evil, 100% evil. So, by being a churchgoer and a Christian, knowing what the Bible says about the blood of Christ, I began to plead the blood in my mind, and little by little, that thing just disappeared like putting, I guess, salt on a slug. I mean, it just kind of evaporated. And I've never forgotten it. I never will. I'm 74 years old, and that was 50 years ago. And but it's just as plain in my head today as it was then.
You had a professor from West Virginia University came to town and tried to calm the masses. You know, he said that, you know, what people were actually seeing was nothing more than just a large bird or a sandhill crane.
Now, there was a biologist from WVU. They contacted him by phone and asked him what his opinions were. And he felt, well, it's a big bird, so the sandhill crane migrates through this area. He thought it landed in the TNT area. A lot of people suspected that birds migrating through that area had drank water or something and picked up some kind of chemicals left over from the TNT area, and it caused them to do a genetic mutation, and you got some weird creature that developed because of it. There was that talk.
This was not a mutation. This was something that was perfectly formed the way it was supposed to be, just like any other thing is.
On November 26th, sightings of the creature continued to come in as several people in Hawking, Ohio, 50 miles north of Point Pleasant, report seeing 4 large birds sitting in bare trees for 2 hours. The birds are described as 4 to 5 feet tall with a 10-foot wingspan. In St. Albans, West Virginia, Miss Ruth Foster is startled to find the Mothman standing in her front yard that evening. She tells a reporter that the creature is over 6 feet tall with big red eyes. The next day, Sheila Kane and her sister see a 7-foot tall gray and white figure with big red eyes near Miss Foster's home in St. Albans. In nearby Charleston, a woman describes seeing the same red eyes peering at her through a window. For the most part, many of the early sightings are nocturnal in nature, but Connie Carpenter, like Thomas Urey, encounters the creature in broad daylight on Sunday, November 27th. At 10:30 a.m., Connie, a New Haven resident, is driving home from church when she sees what she first takes to be a man standing near a deserted golf course. As she draws closer to the figure, her car slows until suddenly large wings unfold from the back of the creature. Connie estimates the wingspan was at least 10 feet wide. The thing then flies straight up into the air and swoops toward her car, as if to attack. Connie is transfixed and horrified by the being's large red eyes, saying, "Once they were fixed on me, I couldn't take my own eyes off them." To further add to the bizarre situation, Connie contracts Cleag conjunctivitis, a condition that causes severe redness, itching, and watering of the eyes. Connie never speaks publicly about her experience. Instead, prefers to forget it ever happened. Perhaps it's Connie's own encounter with the Mothman which helps to motivate her aunt, a local reporter named Mary Hyre, to search for answers in the ongoing series of events. Mary does as much to catalog the high strangeness unfolding in and around Point Pleasant during that time as anyone. She even went so far as to look for mysterious creatures and strange lights in the sky for herself.
And Mary Hyre was a reporter for the Athens Messenger, Athens, Ohio. She had an office here on Main Street here in Point Pleasant.
She was the typical small-town newspaper person. She wasn't going to let this get away from her. And I admire her for what she did.
Mary Hyre is the first person who really wrote an article about the sightings in the local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register.
We really didn't send anybody up there because the people, it's interesting because the people who saw the Mothman didn't call the Herald-Dispatch in Huntington. And I think it's because Mary was so tied into it. They would talk to Mary, but they weren't talking to us. I wish we had sent somebody up there prior to this, but we had some editors who thought, well, this is just a bunch of malarkey.
John Keel was an author from New York City who caught wind of the Mothman activity and the sightings and things, and he came to Point Pleasant right after those first initial sightings. He joined forces with the local newspaper reporter named Mary Hyre. She and John Keel would work together back and forth.
There was a certain part of the community that he visited all the time. He visited some of the Mothman witnesses and some people like that. He was in here a lot.
It's Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's about 50 miles from where Woodrow Derenberger had his contact. As I said, it's 2,500 acres. There are hundreds of these igloos there. There are 4 families living within this area, so it's very thinly populated. If Mothman wanted to live there, not very many people would bother him. And I had some more leads now. As I thought it would, a pattern is building up now, and we may be able to get to the bottom of this one particular case and find out whether Mothman is mechanical or an angel or what he is.
It got so bad that a friend of mine who was a photographer at the newspaper and I decided a couple of nights, because we were so sure that what they were seeing was real, we decided to go up there and see for ourselves. Unfortunately, the UFOs and the creatures didn't appear for us, but we tried.
With December dawning, area residents fully expected the Mothman and UFO sightings to die down. But instead, there is a marked increase. As the number of occurrences escalate, so too does their bizarre nature. On December 4th, 5 pilots at the Gallipolis Airport are killing time between flights when they see a small plane swerving erratically through the sky over the landing strip. As it passes directly overhead, they realize that what they are looking at isn't a plane at all, but rather a massive bird. They describe the creature as being enormous and having a sizable neck and bill. As the sightings continue, so does John Keel's investigation into the phenomena. On December 7th, Keel and Mary Hyre journeyed to the T&T area with a group of 5 original witnesses, including Linda and Roger Scarberry, Mary and Steve Mallett, and Connie Carpenter. Keel, Carpenter, and her boyfriend Keith wander into the abandoned power plant and proceed to walk its length for some time. Suddenly, Connie lets out a scream, proclaiming that she's seen the monster as she dissolves into hysterics. For Keel, This would be the beginning of a series of unusual encounters and experiences in Point Pleasant, which would later be documented in his best-selling book, The Mothman Prophecies. However, Keel isn't the only person seriously investigating the case. A science fiction writer by the name of Gray Barker documents a number of events from this time period and later released them in a semi-fictional novel titled The Silver Bridge. Of course, Point Pleasant's own Mary Hyre continues her own dealings with the story. Her news column, Where the Waters Mingle, becomes the most consistent place to find updated information about the high strangeness. Throughout much of December 1966, activity is rampant around Point Pleasant, much of it going unreported. On the streets and in diners and barbershops, residents all have a story of their own. Usually whispered in hushed tones, they tell of voices in the sky, strange lights in the forest, flying creatures, and mysterious, dark-suited individuals asking questions. John Keel himself begins to feel that he is at the center of something even he can't make sense of.
John Keel had a lot of weird things happen to him after he came to Point Pleasant to investigate the Mothman sightings. His phone calls were monitored. He always felt that somebody was following him. It could have been some of the men in black. His mail would be intercepted from time to time.
48 miles south of Point Pleasant, an appliance store owner named Tad Jones is headed to work when he sees a UFO land on Interstate 64 at around 9 a.m. The next morning, he finds a note under his door reading, "We know what you have seen, and we know that you have talked. You'd better keep your mouth shut." Around town, more and more people encounter strange men who claim to work for undisclosed branches of the government. The majority of these men are dressed in black suits and fedora hats and are driving in black sedans. Their behavior is extremely unusual and at times described as unearthly. Mary Hyre herself receives a visit from the men in black one night in January 1967 while working at her Point Pleasant office.
As soon as those witnesses, started reporting their stories to the newspaper reporters, the TV stations, then these men in black, as some called them, started showing up on people's doorsteps, places of business, asking these witnesses, why they were talking about this, that they really had no reason to be causing panic. And, some of those witnesses were pretty spooked by the sudden appearance of these strange people. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know if they were military. They didn't know if they were government agents or whatever.
This guy, he was in plain clothes, and he says, "I want you to stand out here and point down there where this thing was at." And my wife told him, "Go to hell. I'm not going to stand here like some dumb hillbilly and point to an empty field. Just get out of here." Yeah. He run them off. But it was a spooky thing,
You had several witnesses who claimed that these men in black were actually coming to their house. One lady in particular went out to get the mail one day and a black sedan pulled up. A man got out and tried to pull her into the car, actually ripped her sleeve off of her blouse.
On March 5th, Miss Alice Bradshaw reports seeing a shiny, saucer-shaped UFO while traveling on Beyond Street. Across town, Dolly Grady confers her own sighting of the same craft to Mary Hyre the next day. On March 20th, near Marietta Manufacturing Plant, more UFOs are seen, and throughout much of 1967, flying saucers became all the rage in the area. Sightings are in the hundreds as people flock to the TNT area on clear evenings to watch for strange lights in the sky. On May 19th, two women driving along Route 62 near the TNT area observe a dark form with two brilliant red lights hovering in the sky above them. Though it's airborne, it appears to be some sort of man. Suddenly, a larger red light appears and floats toward the red-eyed man until the two seem to merge. The two women rush into town and report the incident. A few hours later, many others in Point Pleasant report seeing a flaming UFO land in a field near the junior high school. During this time, the Mothman sightings begin to taper off. From April through November 1967, few reports are noted, and even fewer recorded. On November 2nd, Miss Ralph Thomas sees the familiar red eyes of the Mothman behind her home near the TNT area. Then, on November 16th, 1 year and 1 day after the Scarberry and Mallett sighting, the creature appears again when 2 hunters encounter it moving on foot through the McClintock Wildlife Area. In the November 16th, 1967 edition of her column, Mary Hyre reports sightings of the creature are at the forefront again. Most commonly, it's seen buzzing cars on county roads. In late November 1967, an elderly businessman in downtown Point Pleasant sees what he describes as a flaming-eyed gargoyle standing on his front lawn. The two stare at each other for a brief second before the creature flies into the sky without so much as one flap of a wing. It is now December 1967. The pattern has formed. The stage is set.
It did build in a crescendo. You know, there were more and more people looking for it.
In hindsight, I think there was a pattern of escalation, and I have thought about this many times. I wish we had covered the Mothman prior to the collapse of the bridge, but we didn't.
December 15th, 1967 is a day that everybody that lives here in Point Pleasant will remember if they were alive at that time. That is the day that the 40-year-old Silver Bridge, which spanned from Point Pleasant over to Canoga, Ohio, in Gallipolis, collapsed at about 5 o'clock in the evening.
The light was out in town that monitored the traffic on the bridge. It was very busy. A lot of semis. Semis don't come through our town at all now. We just built the bridge around it, but there were a lot of semis on the bridge. Bumper to bumper traffic stopped on the bridge, and it collapsed.
This was on a Friday. It was payday. It was 10 days before Christmas Day. A lot of people out and about, Christmas shopping, Christmas parties, and things like that.
That cable broke, and the bridge swung, and it dumped half the cars into the river. It swung back the other way, broke, dumped the other half into the river, and then it fell on them. And the river, it was right before Christmas. So hypothermia immediately, but the people in the cars, I'm sure in the middle of a conversation, they're in the river, and boom, the bridge falls on, it's over. And seconds.
A woman picked me up in front of the house and took me to Oak Grove Church for this play practice. And we got there at the church about a little after 5. And a car pulled in, and someone said they'd just heard on the car radio that the Silver Bridge had collapsed at Point Pleasant.
Kind of give you an idea, I was in the 3rd grade at the time. You know, everyone here remembers what was going on. You could hear the boom. My mother was on Main Street when the bridge fell. She says there were cars and Christmas gifts floating in the river. It happened quickly, very, very quickly.
I arrived back at my house at about 5:30. My dad had just arrived. We drove down here and parked behind G.C. Murphy's on that parking lot because they were closed. And we got out and walked through the 4th Street Bridge and up there to where the bridge crossed the flood wall. The bridge was clear gone, except for the ramp. It was down the river, and there were search boats out searching, looking for bodies. And so we stayed there till late at night.
One lady in particular who was on the ramp here on the Point Pleasant side, she was actually pregnant with twins. As she approached that ramp, the bridge just basically fell, right in front of her. Her car almost teetered, right on the edge of that ramp. And I guess a policeman, pulled her out of the car. She went into shock.
I got up there and saw very few people on the Ohio side. Most of the people who were in shock were hanging around the West Virginia side that night. But I got up that night, and From the Ohio side, what I saw were boats coming in. It was interesting because there were towboats coming in to see if they could do anything, pick up any debris or bodies or whatever. So I reported that night from the Ohio side, and it was very quiet, almost spooky, because there was nothing on the Ohio side.
Lost a girl in my class. Went down with her. Her body was never recovered. Our mayor, his parents, lost his parents. A lot of prominent people went down on that bridge from both towns, and then a lot of people who were in the ultimate wrong place at the wrong time. It was numbing. Plus, you were watching them drag the bridge out of the river, and they were pounding it up right here on the other side. And every day they were dragging the river for bodies. Some of the bodies they could get, some they couldn't. People were still trying to figure out who was on the bridge, who wasn't.
Yeah, that ramp, when you would drive through town, you would just see the ramp, just a dead break right off the edge there. And that was a real somber, reminder for people here as they drove for years after that ramp was there. So that was a bad reminder for people.
But other than that, but that's people my age. The kids now don't think anything about it. They don't know anything about it. In fact, the Silver Bridge is part of the Mothman legend. To them, not a disaster that we went through. And
people are definitely still affected by it. Definitely. I don't think it'll ever be forgotten. I hope that it's not ever forgotten. The stories are passed down. It's a part of this community. It's a part of who everyone is. I hope that it's never forgotten. That would be very sad if it was forgotten.
I don't remember anybody when I went up there that night saying, as I have seen in subsequent years, well, we saw the Mothman perched on the bridge that night before class. I never heard that.
it was really never connected to the bridge in terms of, we've heard people say it was around the bridge or whatever. I'll tell you what happened at the time. No one wanted to hear about the Mothman anymore. And it died completely. Completely.
It put a real calming effect on the Mothman and the Men in Black and the UFO stuff, because everybody's attention went from that to the bridge disaster.
In the days following the bridge collapse, residents along the Ohio River continued to note the appearance of strange lights in the sky. However, the Mothman itself is gone. John Keel and Mary Hyre eventually part ways for what would be the last time, leaving Mary as the only continuing source of information regarding unusual events in the region. Back in New York, Keel begins work on his book, The Mothman Prophecies. On February 15, 1970, Mary Hyre passes away from an illness that left her bedridden in a hospital for nearly a month. Keel receives word of Hyre's passing in a telegram from Gray Barker. Hyre's column, Where the Waters Mingle, was a beloved part of the community for over 2 decades, and her passing is felt far and wide throughout the area. Her death also signals the end of consistent reporting on the strange and unusual in the area. 5 years after Mary's death, Keel releases The Mothman Prophecies. The book becomes a bestseller and is widely acclaimed for its unavoidably unnerving recounting of not just the creature sightings, but the multiple bizarre phenomena occurring in and around the country during that time. The book would later be adapted as a major motion picture by the same name, released in 2002. Keel himself felt he was never able to escape the lure of the story and continued his involvement in paranormal research until the time of his death on July 3rd, 2009.
I think I admired him a great deal too. I think he did an excellent job of making the connections, I'm glad he did.
And of course, he's really the one that's responsible for turning this into a worldwide legend.
Even though he'd be in New York, they would call him and say, hey, we've seen it again, you need to come back. And sadly, he never had a chance to really see it.
Occasional sightings of the Mothman continue even to this day. From the back roads around Point Pleasant to the creature's old stomping grounds within the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, tales of encounters are still told. In other parts of the country and even the world, the Mothman has been frequently associated with disasters, acting as much as a harbinger of doom as an unexplainable mystery. Point Pleasant itself has embraced the mysterious creature as its own. In 2002, local residents Jeff Walmsley and Carolyn Harris created the first ever Mothman Festival, celebrating this particular chapter in the Mountain State's history. In 2005, Walmsley opened the world's only Mothman Museum. The town is now more associated with the creature than any other piece of its long and storied history. Many of the original witnesses have passed away, and in recent years, other key players in the Mothman story, such as Carolyn Harris, have passed on as well. Still, Point Pleasant remains a sleepy little town on the banks of a mighty river in the heart of the Ohio Valley.
The town hasn't changed that much, quite frankly. It doesn't take much to turn Point Pleasant back to 1966. Take off the new cars, bring in the old cars. It's virtually the same.
For several years, they talked about the Mothman nonstop, and it didn't die out because journalists and book authors and magazine writers and people like that came to town, and they kept it pretty well stirred up. But I actually thought that it was dying off some, a little bit. Then all of a sudden this movie, Mothman Prophecies, came out.
I was 6 years old, 6 years old when the Mothman sightings started taking place and the Silver Bridge disaster. As I got older, I thought it was really cool that it was part of the history of the town. I started collecting stuff. My dad had shot home movies of the bridge disaster, and I seen what kind of interest basically the world, has shown over the whole Mothman story. So I just kept looking and finding stuff and archiving and things like that.
The Mothman Museum acts as a sort of window into another time. Through decades of research, Jeff Walmsley has amassed an impressive collection of newspaper articles, memorabilia, and historical items related to the 1966-67 case and the Mothman itself. While the rest of the world continues to view the Mothman as a kitschy folk figure and the events surrounding its original appearance as a rural legend, the museum helps to solidify the reality behind the case. In recent years, the Mothman Festival has become the largest annual event in the state of West Virginia, with an annual attendance of more than 12,000 people. The Mothman, it seems, is truly immortal.
The Mothman Festival came about back in 2003 as a way to capitalize a little bit on the movie, the Mothman Prophecies, and get some people to come downtown, help out the merchants and the downtown stores and things like that. And 15 years later, it's grown to be one of the biggest festivals in the state of West Virginia. We draw crowds of 10,000 plus now every September.
There are a lot of people that like the festival, and and they like the Mothman Museum. Now there's a few in the community, there are a few skeptics.
I hope he doesn't come back. I don't want to say him. If he wants royalties, we're in trouble.
The fact that there are so many unanswered questions, you know, when it comes to the Mothman, if it would have been 2 or 3 people that reported the sightings and stuff, I would have been, you know, more than skeptical myself. But the fact that there was over 100 reported sightings within that first year tells me that there was definitely something going on. And it's always intrigued me as, you know, as to what these people were seeing, you know, where they encountered it, how it affected their lives.